Strange, welcome back to Apollos Water.
Great to be back. Redux, I'm back.
You know the drill, and are you ready for the Fast Five?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, here we go. Favorite binging TV show?
Oh, I've watched Billions, and I feel very it's the kind of it's just finished with Paul Giamatti. It's been over 7 series, and I've followed it all the way through. I don't normally do that, but I have really enjoyed it.
Okay. Number 2, how about this one? Christian writer who has influenced you the most and why?
Oh, well, that probably will be J.H. Bavinck, I think. Increasingly on mission. I mean, we'll be talking about him today, but I love his kind of it's not just what he writes, it's the way he writes, and he seemed like an incredibly godly person, and just the whole package. So J.H. Bavinck.
Okay, here we go. Number 3 then. Favorite thing about coming to America?
Oh, the food. I mean, by what the hospitality industry in general, I would say. Your customer service. I mean, I find it awe-inspiring. And I know people are doing it. We don't have a tip system here. And I know people are doing it for tips, but I don't mind. I just like people being nice to me. Sometimes you get the impression in the UK that, you go into a place and it's almost, why would you want to be here? Or what are you doing here? Whereas the warmth of hospitality, even though I know it's for money. And I think my last trip, I just had a burger every single night. So burgers and good hospitality. Thank you.
Okay. How about this one then? How about the best British food that you think all Americans should try?
Oh, wow. The best I would say fish and chips and proper tea. Fish and chips and tea. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
What do you mean a proper tea? What do you mean proper tea?
Well, I think, no, as in a cup of tea, as in, I don't know whether you guys really get tea properly. Fish and a good old traditional fish and chips and a good tea. That's the best we have to offer, I think.
Does the fish and chips, is it just standard across the board, or does everyone do their little
no, everyone no, everyone has their we've moved to the north of the country now, and they do their own way of doing things. So yes, it's very fish and chips.
Okay. All right, here we go. Number 5. What's your favorite thing about being British?
Oh, probably the sense of humor. This has been with American colleagues over the years when I was teaching. It's taken a while for them to get for there to be a kind of a meeting of minds when it comes to humor. So I think the ironic, understated, sarcastic cynicism, I quite like that. I know Americans sometimes find that very difficult. That kind of understated humor.
I was talking to some Canadian friends, and they said the same thing. They're like, they just don't get the sarcasm, the Canadian sarcasm. I think there's a little bit of that in British humor too.
Oh, definitely. Although it's interesting. I still think there are lots of Americans who like British comedy and vice versa, but I think it takes a bit of getting used to.
When I saw the British Office, like I'd seen the American Office before I saw the British Office. And so when I watched the British Office, it was so awkward. Like it was painful. I was oh no. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I've started watching the new Frasier, and it's not as good as the old, but I still think you can do comedy well, you guys. You can.
Okay. Well, on that note, let's transition. We have been talking about the last few times we've been together. Actually, the last time we were together, we were talking about your book, Magnetic Points.
Yep.
And we've been talking about evangelism, but I want to talk more generally about mission. And we're going to get into J.H. Bavinck here in just a moment. But we know that Jesus calls us to be on mission with him. John 17. It's not an extra thing. It's actually the essence of who we are. As Jesus said, as the Father sent me, so I send you. So we're sent to fulfill his mission. But I find that most Christians that I interact with are very confused on that mission. What is that mission, and why is it so important?
Yeah, so I mean, I talk about 2 things. Well, a few things to say. The first would be the the cultural mandate of Genesis 1 and 2 to have dominion, to fill and subdue the earth to the glory of God. I don't think that has ever been abrogated. I think it's restated in the Great Commission of Matthew 28, go and make disciples of all nations. So it's a kind of the cultural mandate Mark II, but recognizing the need for conversion, that people need to turn from idols to the living God, all for the glory of God. So I think in terms of my kind of reformed, I suppose, Baptistic way of understanding it, if mission has three elements historically, ultimately we do everything for the glory of God. But I suppose you might say the building up of the church and the conversion of unbelievers, those three elements, maybe part of the problem is that we've only concentrated on one of those when actually we need to be doing all three at the same time. I think that's what we'll be coming to when we talk about this later on today. You know, they're not three separate missions. They're one mission. That's one mission to do evangelism, to do apologetics, to call people to Christ, to disciple people, help them grow up in the Lord, to mature, all for the glory of God. I think that's the mission that I want to be involved with, and I think is biblically mandated. So yeah, Great Commission, cultural mandate, Great Commission, and those kinds of three strands of the glorification of God, the conversion of the unbeliever, and the building up of the believer.
So wait a minute. You said three, and I missed there's like 3 or 4 sets of 3 there. So there's a cultural mandate, Great Commission,
cultural mandate and Great Commission, I'd say, are two kind of, you know, the Genesis 1 and 2 and the Matthew 28. I think that's a kind of the mission that we've been given. I think, though, that again, another way of putting it would be everything is to glorify God in terms of Soli Deo Gloria, one of the great, you know, slogans of the Reformation. But I think in terms of what we mean by mission, in terms of the building up of the discipleship and evangelism, I suppose then, sorry, and then the other thing, I mean, the only other thing I'd say is, again, seeing mission as both, well, I mean, this goes back to the discussion of, you know, what is the gospel? And I think, you know, the Kevin DeYoung, Greg Gilbert thing is quite helpful here. There's a zoom focus and a wide angle lens. So the zoom focus being, you know, the importance of people coming to know Jesus as their personal savior. I still think that's absolutely crucial. But the wide angle lens that God is doing something that's cosmic in its scope, creation, fall, redemption, consummation. They're not two gospels, they're one gospel. There's one mission at that point. So there's kind of a narrow focus, and there's a narrow focus in terms of individuals, but there's a cosmic focus, the renewal of all creation. And that has all kinds of implications for what we think about work, what we think about, you know, engagement in society. So that bigger theme there of the kingdom of God, I think, is crucial.
Huge. I am in complete agreement with you. It is absolutely huge. All right, though, but how does that mission, like we've talked about this generally, but how does that differ place to place? Because sometimes we think, well, there's a one size fits all mission,
yeah,
but its expression might be different. So how does that differ in place to place?
Travis, it's theological. You know, we at the end of the day, we are created, finite, limited cultural beings located to a particular place where God has called us. And we can't bypass that. We're not acultural beings. We're always embodied in a particular time and place. And even though there is only one gospel and one gospel message, this is where the word, I suppose, contextualization comes in. That we're kind of limited by our own locatedness. I think I probably said this in the last program, but you know, in 1 Corinthians 1, we do preach Christ crucified, but that message is not a kind of a generic Platonic 30,000 feet message, because in 1 Corinthians 1, Paul still contextualizes that for two sets of ethnic groups, Jews who look for power and Greeks who look for wisdom. Jews are not Greeks, Greeks are not Jews. And we still preach Christ crucified, which is a stumbling block. But to those who have been saved, Christ is the power, what Jews are looking for. Christ is wisdom, what Greeks are looking for, in precisely the opposite way that those things would be brought about. But Paul still does that work. In Acts 17, he wanders around the objects of worship. So I think that it's just a recognition of our createdness, that mission needs to be contextualized in different cultures at different times. Now, you can go as micro and macro as you want to. You could say the gospel needs to be contextualized for American culture, but of course, there's all this, what does it mean for each state? What does it mean for each town? What does it mean for each neighborhood? What does it mean for each, of course, you can go, or you can go more macro. What does it mean for West versus South? Or what does it mean for humanity? So you're always kind of making generalizations or being more specific. But the idea that we need to understand this, and this is how we get traction with people, is crucial. So I think that's why mission in that sense is localized. We need to do the hard work, theological truths. But what does that mean? That's why we do the hard work in understanding it, where we are, where God has put us. And that's crucial as well. So it's those two things together, I think.
Knowing this, that we have to contextualize the gospel, that means that we also have to be able to be in proximity to people to contextualize with them. I mean, that's assumed in the middle of all that. And you and I were chatting before this about what you called pre-evangelism. How do we get into proximity to build relationships with these people that are different than us? Simply because oftentimes our nature says we want to be able to congregate with people who look like us, believe like us. There's safety that's there. We're wired to find who we belong to. And to step out of that takes it's very difficult to do, number one, because you have to mentally and emotionally do it. And then number two, we're already so busy that the idea of doing one more thing, especially something that's as awkward and difficult, it's not easy to do. How do we go about finding and creating the space to build these relationships with people?
Well, the first thing I think is seeing, like, I think maybe we often see evangelism as being part of our lives, and our lives are like a pie chart where we have kind of church, work, and evangelism is part of that. And it's a kind of a sliver of the pie chart. And it's very compartmentalized. Whereas I don't think life's like that. Our lives are not like a pie chart. They're more like a flow diagram where everything links into everything else. So I think, as I said to you beforehand, what has been a real revelation for me, it's a very simple thing, is that this idea that our evangelism flows from our discipleship. That is to say, if I know what it means for me to be a Christian and for what Christ means for me in any particular area of life and the implications for that, then when I'm in the same culture as someone else who isn't a Christian, there's a starting point because we're in the same culture. We struggle with the same issues. And if I know how it applies to my life, then I'll be able to talk about how it applies to someone else rather than seeing people as a project or just completely different. Now, of course, there is a fundamental difference between a Christian and a non-Christian in terms of one is alive and one is dead. I mean, that's key. One is blind and one he can see. But there's a common humanity that we share. And I think knowing how we still at the end of 1 John, we have to keep ourselves from idols. That gives a sense of fellow feeling, solidarity with other people, rather than seeing people as just projects or just different. And if we love them, we'll want to be getting to know them, and that means building relationships. That means trust, because I think when we're talking about people talking about their deepest, darkest desires, hopes, fears, dreams, you don't do that with a stranger, do you? I mean, you do that with someone who knows you, who you trust. So I think there's a holistic nature to it. And so, yeah, it's all of those things, really. Yeah.
When we're talking about these ways of connecting with people, this holistic nature of mission, it flows from our lives. One of the things you've written about, and we talked about this the last time that you were on the show, is the magnetic points.
Yeah.
And I wanted to review those just for those who are unfamiliar,
sure.
and just jumping onto this today. But what are the magnetic points and where did they originate from?
Great. Yeah. So the magnetic points then originate from this thinker, this missionary called J.H. Bavinck. And he said, look, if you go to Romans 1, religion is a response to God's revelation. And what we do with God's revelation, because we know God, we're accountable to him, we depend upon him, is that in our sin, we suppress the truth and we substitute it for all kinds of other things, idolatry. So Bavinck takes that standard anthropology and he says, when you have image bearers who suppress the truth and substitute it for other things, if you kind of mix those ingredients together, he says that everyone has what he calls a religious consciousness, which is this kind of the fact that we know God and don't know him at the same time. We're running to him and running away from him at the same time. So it's a very complex, messy mix. And Bavinck calls that religious consciousness. Now, what Bavinck says is if we unpack the religious consciousness, he says in his context, and he's working in kind of, I suppose, more world religion context, he says, look, religious consciousness seems to mean that whether a person's a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Muslim, or, as I would say, a secular nun, None, because we're still made in the image of God, because we still suppress the truth and substitute it, there's a common humanity that we all have. He says, look, there seems to be these 5 questions or 5 points that people are always answering, not consciously, but often subconsciously. And he calls these the magnetic points. They're like itches that we have to scratch. And they're not, again, don't compartmentalize them. They're all perspectives on the one religious consciousness. But he says there's 5. There's totality, our desire for connection. Is there a way to connect? We want to belong to something bigger than ourselves, because then we feel significant. If we don't connect, we feel insignificant. So we're always striving for connection. Norm, is there a way to live? We all have standards. We all have rules of who's in and who's out, what's acceptable and what's not. And all cultures, even countercultural movements, have these norms. Deliverance, is there a way out? We all look for, we all think there's a problem with the world, but we can't agree on what the problem is, let alone whether there's a solution. And this deliverance is not just looking forward, it's looking back. It's kind of saying, wasn't it great when America was this? And that's where we seek deliverance. And again, it can be big existential questions like, what happens when I die? Is there deliverance from that? But it's also the mundane, everyday deliverance of, how do I get through the day without another drink or another fix? Or how do I, I'll only get deliverance today when the house is tidy, because that's what I have control of. So there's all kinds of ways in which we seek deliverance. And then fourthly, destiny. Is there a way we control? And Bavinck says human beings are funny, because he says we both lead our lives and undergo our lives. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I think I'm the master of my own destiny. I can do what I want. I can create my own future. I have freedom. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, I'm in someone else's chess game. I'm a puppet on a string. I don't have any freedom. And this is an interesting point, Travis. When I've been doing this material in other countries, it's amazing how there are almost the spirit of a culture answers that question very differently. When I was in Slovakia in Central Europe, teaching this to a group of pastors, I said, are Slovakians generally people who think that they're in control or under control? And 99% of them said, we are a nation whose psyche is, we've always been under control by other powers. It was the Hungarian Empire, it was the Czech Empire, the Czechs. So there's a real psyche there of always feeling that we're left out, we're not considered. What's the point? Why bother doing anything? Because it's just going to happen to us, a kind of a fatalism. Now, whenever I've done this material in the States, Americans are completely the opposite. It is a kind of a, I don't mean this technically, but it is a kind of a manifest destiny. It's just get things done. We can do whatever we want to. There's a real positivity there. Now, who's to say which is right and which is wrong? Because I think in some senses both are true, but it's amazing how different cultures, how different cultural contexts will answer that question differently, which in turn will end up meaning the way that we talk about the gospel will be shaped, our communication will be shaped by whether I'm talking to an American about destiny or whether I'm talking to a Slovakian about destiny. That's where the rubber hits the road on culture. And then finally, the fifth point, which is kind of the super magnetic point. Is there a way, a higher power? Is there a way beyond? I suppose the difference in Bavinck's context is that everyone believes in gods when he's ministering in Asia in the 60s, whereas now I think this is the magnetic point that has to be excavated, but it's where all the other points converge. Where do we get connection from and significance? Who gives us the norm and tells us what to do? Where does deliverance come from? Who is in control? Is it someone outside of ourselves? And the more we press onto that, the more we answer that question. Is there a reality beyond reality? So they're the kind of the magnetic points. And I think they're a very helpful analytical tool to get traction, even in cultures where people don't call themselves religious. The Bible says we're all religious, and the magnetic points are a kind of a morphology or a toolbox that can help us answer those questions, of which, giving the game away, the gospel and Jesus Christ is the answer. Jesus ultimately is the way we connect. He is the norm. He is our deliverance. He is the one in control, and yet we still have responsibility. And he is the way, the truth, and the life. So that's where the magnetic points link to the gospel. So that's a long way of explaining that question.
I don't think it's a long way at all. I think it's something that helps us to see in detail what God has done across the world. I mean, that's just how we are his imagers. We've got this thing within each one of us that is his way of providing a clue that he's in the world. I think of Bertrand Russell when he said, when he was asked, why aren't you a Christian? He said, not enough evidence. I don't understand how he could ever say that when you look at all of these different pieces that are there. Now, you've referenced multiple times Bavinck as the author that's influenced you the most, person who's given you the magnetic points, but let's help our audience. Let's introduce our audience further to him. Who is this man?
Yes. So the first thing to say is, yes, if you've heard of the name Bavinck, and you may not have done, he's not the Bavinck that often people talk about. So Herman Bavinck was J.H. Bavinck's uncle. I'm talking about a guy called J.H. Bavinck, who was the nephew of the more famous Herman Bavinck, who wrote these Reformed dogmatics. So this is the nephew. He was born in 1895. He died in 1964. He was part of the Dutch Reformed Church, and he spent his years overseas, I suppose, between about 1919 and 1934 in Indonesia. He lectured in Java. And even then, he was really interested, going back to what we spoke about before, Travis, he was really interested in what it meant for indigenous expressions of the faith. And then in around the late 30s, he comes back to teach in Kampen in the Netherlands, and then finally at the Free University of Amsterdam, where he did some of his kind of most important theological work. I mean, he was always writing. So yeah, that's who he was. He was a missiologist and a missions lecturer. What's interesting about him, and where there's, I suppose, connection with people that we might know, is that his book, J.H. Bavinck's book, An Introduction to the Science of Missions, which was published in about 1961, that was the standard missiological textbook for seminaries, even in the States, for many years. And J.H. Bavinck very heavily influenced Ed Clowney at Westminster, and also a guy called Harvey Conn, who was a very famous missiologist. And the link there is that Tim Keller was taught by both Clowney and Conn. So there is a bit of a direct line from J.H. Bavinck through Clowney and Conn through to Keller. And I think you see a lot of, probably not explicitly, although, Tim Keller, before he died, and we chatted about J.H. Bavinck quite a lot. And there's a bit of a Bavinck resurgence at the moment, whether that's the uncle or the nephew. But I think you see those kinds of family characteristics there. So yeah, that's an introduction to J.H. Bavinck.
You've mentioned this resurgence of both the Bavincks, and I would agree. I was speaking at a conference in Connecticut. It was a Baptist conference with these young Slavic young people, and Slavics say young means 12 to 30. It's usually what they mean to that. It's a very wide berth. It's there. You can be married with children and you could still consider to youth.
Yeah.
But while I was there, I do a thing every Saturday evening of this weekend where they can ask anything. And one of the questions they asked was on Herman Bavinck. And it was basically a 19-year-old young man who's reading on Herman Bavinck, not looking just at JH, but both the Bavincks.
Yeah.
Why has there been such a resurgence and a desire, especially of these younger people, to learn who these, in some ways, obscure Dutch theologians that most people out there aren't aware of? What is it about them that draws them in?
I mean, I think there's a richness. I suppose both Herman and JH would be considered to be part of, I suppose, what you might call neo-Calvinism. And I mean, there's been a lot written on neo-Calvinism recently. And there's been some key figures. I mean, there's a guy called Grace Atando and Corey Brock who have just done a new handbook to a new introduction to neo-Calvinism. I'm just contributing to a bigger handbook on neo-Calvinism. And a guy called James Eglinton who wrote a big biography of Bavinck, Herman Bavinck. I think there's a richness to the theology that is just very substantial. I mean, it's a rich tradition. And I think when we're talking about issues to do with anthropology and human beings and how we know, these are very learned, biblically well-read people who come from a reformed kind of Calvinistic tradition, but who are willing to engage that reformed theology with, well, what was the modern thinking or modern culture of their day, and that needs to be done again for our generation as well. So I think that's part of it. It's really helping to deal with the thirst that I think people have that we maybe weren't getting from a kind of a thin evangelicalism that really isn't substantial enough, whereas these are deep thinkers but completely rooted in the solas of the Reformation in a way that I think is very attractive. So deep theologically, but deep culturally in understanding the times and knowing what we should do in terms of those Menovissica in Chronicles. So I think that's partly the reason for it. And also I think obviously in the American context, the Dutch Reformed heritage has been there in certain communities for a long time, less so in the UK, and that's probably why Herman and JH are probably less well known. But I think that's partly one of the reasons.
Well, let's talk about his book that you have endorsed. You wrote the introduction for it. So, and you had mentioned how you found this book, but the church between temple and mosque. A study of the relationship between Christianity and other religions. I know some people are saying, I have no idea why I would want to read this book. This isn't something you're going to necessarily get at like Barnes and Noble or any of the.
Oh, no.
I mean, it's not like that. This is a book that requires some knowledge, some concentration. It's challenging going through it, but it's still important work, especially at this cultural moment in which we find ourselves.
Yeah.
Why is this book so important? So important, matter of fact, that you would write an introduction to a book of a man who's been dead since 1964.
Sure.
I mean,
well, look, firstly, and I say this at the beginning, in some ways the book preserved my spiritual sanity. So I was just started as an undergraduate theology and religious studies student at a very mainstream secular university. And I realized very early on that some of the people that had influenced me in my evangelical life, none of my lecturers or none of the reading lists had anything to do with what I believed in. I mean, I realized that very early on, that to be a Bible believing Christian in this degree that I'd undertaken was going to be very challenging. And so I staggered into the main university library, and I on the shelves again, I couldn't find anything that I would have anything in common with people. But then I think it was the Scottish Bulletin of Evangelical Theology. They'd reprinted one of the chapters from this book, which I'll talk about in a minute, Church Between Temple and Mosque. And yeah, it was just a lifeline, because it was Bavinck was talking about Romans 1, talking about how we know and don't know God, how using Calvin's term that our minds have become a factory of idols. And all of a sudden, I realized, here is someone who actually did engage. So coming across that chapter, and then I realized it was part of a bigger book called The Church Between Temple and Mosque. Now, what's interesting is that these were published only after they're posthumous, so they were only published as lectures after Bavinck had died. And what's fascinating is that it looks as if these were lectures that he gave when he came to the States around 1959 and 60, in the Federated Theological Department of Chicago. So these are lectures that he gave in English, or they were translated. He gave them in English, or they were translated into English to a group of American students. And what's fascinating is at that time in the 1960s, the one of the most famous scholars of religion in the world was a Romanian scholar called Mircea Eliade, and he's very, very famous. If you're in the world of religious studies, you'll have heard of him. He's one of the godfathers of religious studies. But apparently, Eliade had read an earlier book by Bavinck, one of his other great books called Religious Consciousness and the Christian Faith. And on the basis of that, he'd invited Bavinck to come over to teach in Chicago. So these were lectures given to seminary students. And I think it's, some of his best writing. And so that's how I got into it. And then the book had been out of print for many, many years. So Westminster Seminary Press said, look, we're interested in republishing it, doing a new edition. I think the rights were Erdmann's, and they got the rights from Erdmann's Publishing. So they asked me, would I write a new foreword, which tries to, and I think this answers your final point, Travis, that even though this book is in the context of Bavinck's, his context is more kind of what you might call, world religion. So he talks about, animism and Buddhism and Hinduism, but the theological structure is as relevant for your average secular American and Brit as it is these other religions. It's the theological structure which is so beautiful. And this is one of two areas of his writing where he starts to talk about these magnetic points. So the magnetic points bit I was talking about earlier, they kind of come from this book, The Church Between Temple and Mosque. So that's why everyone should read this book, because it's as relevant for, as I say at the end, something like, the church between temple and mosque, or between the Amazon warehouse and the internet provider. It's as relevant, because the anthropology, the theological anthropology, what the Bible says about human beings, is exactly the same, even though Bavinck was writing this and lecturing this in the late 1950s.
Taking that into consideration, knowing that this book is so relevant to today, let's break it down even further on how people can utilize the truths that are in this book.
Yeah.
Like, get really practical.
Yeah.
So go ahead. I was going to say that I'm in a community where there's the large Indian population, let's say, and there's also a lot of people that they're highly aspirational. They live in the suburbs. Their children are involved in all these different kinds of activities. Help us to see how I can bridge those two gaps with this book, and sitting down with this family that values education. They're from India. They are highly aspirational. They make a lot of money. They go to temple. I don't ever see them there. I don't go there myself, obviously. And then my daughter is involved in a high school band. And yet these families are sitting side by side with us in the stadium seats. Help us to see how we can actually practically build a relationship here. I'm probably asking a little bit too much, but and how these then would apply to that kind of relationship.
Yeah. So I think I talk about two things. I talk about, I suppose, a method and the manner. So the method would be, again, using these magnetic points to try and work out how these people in both of those different contexts are answering those different magnetic points in their lives. Where are they looking for belonging and significance? Now, you've mentioned, it could be family, it could be education. That could answer the deliverance question as well. What are their norms? And then what we have to do, and this is what I've written about, Bavinck writes about this here a little bit, but in some of my other work in the book called Plugged In, where I try to give a kind of a method that we're to enter someone's world and then explore their worldview. And then what we have to do very gently and lovingly is try and expose that the way that we're trying to answer the magnetic points without Christ will lead to disappointment and disillusionment, because they're fundamentally looking for kind of the right things in all the wrong places. And we need to show that gently, in the way that we ask questions, in the way that we're there when these things ultimately do fall down. And that means personal relationship. But I think we can try and be intentional in the way that we're trying to bring out that actually, at the end of the day, if people can see that they are looking for connection, they are looking for norm, they might not call themselves religious at all, or they might. But what we're doing then is, in everything in our interactions with people, we're trying to do a compare and contrast. And then we can say how we find ultimate connection, how we work out our norms, what we think about deliverance. So it's just a framework for our conversations to be more, and our relationships to be more intentional. So there is definitely a kind of I'm not going to call it a strategy, but there's a kind of a framework that gives us the eyes to see people who sometimes might not be interested in anything we have to say, because they think, well, I'm not a Christian, I'm not religious, but we know that they are, and that's an encouragement. There's always a point of contact, or what Bavinck says, I suppose, a point of attack, I suppose. But then the manner, this is where I think Church Between Temple and Mosque and Bavinck, this is why I'm so influenced by him. You know, he was a sinner saved by grace, but the way that he writes, there's such a love. Even though he's very hard on idolaters need to turn from idols to the living God. It could be education, it could be the Hindu god in the temple. But he recognizes that there's a real love for the other. And his writing is so it's out of a sense of love. And he has this great line where he says, look, we need to unmask sin in other people's lives. We need to convict people of sin. But we'll only do that when we realize that the weapons we use on other people have been used on us first. So I need to have a grace-filled life. And there's, in my evangelism and my apologetics and witness, there's no sense of superiority. I'm another sinner saved by grace, talking to someone who needs God's grace. I'm one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. And I think that manner is very attractive, because Bavinck's all about relationship. I mean, I would say about J.H. Bavinck's writing, as one of his biographer, a guy called Paul Visser, says, if you're looking for kind of like Protestant scholasticism, you won't find it with Bavinck. He's a very almost romantic, mystical writer. He beautiful turns of phrase. He writes really well. But there's this idea that, he just seemed to love other people. And I think that goes a long way in our witness. So in answer to your question, I'd want to say two things. There's certainly an intentionality and a way that we need to help people see that they're drinking from cracked cisterns that cannot hold water, to quote Jeremiah 2, and we have a fountain of living water that has impacted our life. But also that fellow feeling of, I'm just a sinner saved by grace. I'm not superior morally, intellectually, but I have met the Lord Jesus Christ, and I want you to meet him as well. And to be able to say what Christ has done in my life and what he could do in your life. I think there's a very personal, relational nature to our witness. And again, that moves away from people being seen as aliens or projects or things. These are fellow human beings. And yes, they need Christ, just as I needed Christ.
That is excellent. That is excellent. And it almost steals the thunder of my last question here. We're coming to the end of our time. We have a short time today, but what we have done at the end of the show traditionally is tell people this is your water bottle for the week, something for them to sip on, a spiritual truth that'll carry them and nourish them and keep them nourished through the week.
Yeah.
What is a water bottle that we can give our audience before we conclude our time together today?
Yeah, I think we live by faith, not by sight. Sometimes we're trying to witness to people in our context who we think we're banging our head against a brick wall. They don't seem interested. They're even hostile. We want to talk about Jesus and we can never get the conversation in. It seems so difficult. And I think we can feel demoralized. And actually we're tempted then to kind of move from what might be called an orthodox gospel to try and accommodate Jesus, or to kind of, syncretize. Look, what we have to do is trust what the Bible says about human beings. And if Bavinck is right, if what I'm saying is right, as I write this introduction to the Temple and Mosque, and, you know, that we need to trust our theology that says that all human beings, that however much they suppress the truth, it's never totally suppressed. We can never completely deface our image of godness. There's always a way in. There's always a point of contact. Yes, we may have to dig really hard, and it may take a lifetime of relationship, but God hasn't left himself without a witness. And people, in some ways, are all, however much we suppress the truth, to suppress the magnetic points, we have to answer them somehow. You know, people of Athens, I see that you're very religious. That religiosity has to come out somewhere. And so there'll always be a way in. Yes, we need to be creative. We need to take risks. But the water bottle moment would be, don't give up. If the Bible is right about what it says about human beings, there will always be a way in. And we're speaking to that image of Godness in people. There's this kind of hardware, software compatibility problem that all unbelievers have, because they are made in the image of God. They're made for him. And yet we do try and deface the truth. We write all over it, but we can never totally do that. And that would be the encouragement to everyone who sometimes we feel so kind of, it seems like such hard soil, and it is hard soil in the West, especially as the gospel tide goes out. And yet there's always a way in, and we need to be creative. We need to be innovative, but there's always hope. And just keep on trying to find out how are other people answering these magnetic points, and what can we say about how Jesus both confronts and connects. And we see that in our life first of all as well.
That is a tremendous encouragement. Dan, as we finish our time together today, what is a way, or how can people follow you and keep up with your
so Dr. Dan Strange's Twitter, Facebook. I'm the director of something called Crosslands Forum. We're providing resources for the church, from first steps in discipleship. We have these great foundation courses on all kinds of topics that small groups in churches, lay people can use as individuals or as groups, through to a seminary that we have an in context seminary where we have about 150 students all over the place, doing a kind of a in context training in churches, through to PhD as well. So we're just trying to offer theological resources that will help do exactly what I've been talking about today. How do we equip the church? How do we train trainers? How do we have theological educational cultures in our churches, wherever God has gifted people at whatever level that might be? We always need to be thinking, we always need to be saying, we always need to be working on formation. And that's the true of pastors as well. Pastors need to be continually being formed, as well as people that they're looking after. So check out, go to Google, just type in Crosslands training and we'll come up. And we'd love to talk to you if you're interested in any theological training resources. And it's just great. I mean, it's great to know, Travis, that, what we're doing, what you're doing at Apollos Watered, what places like, the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. I think a number of groups are realizing that this is a really important time, especially I think in American life and culture, where you're questioning your own identity, and that can come out in all kinds of ugly ways. But I think grasping the idea that your average American Christian is in a cross-cultural mission situation, I think that's one of the key things that we need to do. And that will need a mindset, a culture change, a paradigm shift. And I know that you're committed to that, and God be with you in trying to communicate that to your audience.
Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate that, and to encouragement for both of us as we're both trying to do this. And as I was talking to Malcolm Guite, and he said, no matter how bad it gets, Jesus got down to 11 and he was fine. So if we get down, God is going to be faithful. But brother, thank you so much for your ministry, and it was such a joy to have you on the show today.
Thanks, Travis. Thanks, everyone.